Hello, this is Kenneth Brashears again, and we are back with session 3. Once again, I'm with King Road Baptist Church as someone who's somewhat called upon every now and then to give a class or preach. And with this session, we had gone over basically the Reformation era and the era surrounding it, but more so concerned with the text than we are with the actual events of the Reformation, although they do come up. We ended the last session with the schism of 1054. Now, the reason I was talking about those things, although there was a plethora of events and things that took place, and the one thing I wanted to illustrate was the divide between East and West and how the Greek language eventually fell somewhat out of use in the West. Now, it's not to say there weren't people who knew Greek. There were people, but their knowledge of Latin superseded what they knew of Greek, and it's kind of difficult to do. And I was trying to basically build that part up as opposed to other aspects of history, but primarily the history of the text, especially for us who speak the English language. I am more concerned about us who speak the English language for this because that's the language we speak. If I spoke Spanish, I would do a Spanish one. But I'm also going to go over some other key things leading all the way up to the King James translation that was finished and then published in 1611, and some of the events surrounding that, as well as some, excuse me, some extra thoughts. So this overview, basically what we're going over, we're going to start with Desiderius Erasmus. Now, I am excluding somebody when it comes to the English Bible, and that is John Wycliffe. Those who don't know of John Wycliffe, I would hope most people do. He was actually the very first person to put a Bible translation into English. I believe he took the Latin Vulgate in the late 1300s and he translated that into the then English language. And again, 1300s English. If you were to pick it up and try to read it, you probably couldn't read it. They actually did make a modern, updated version of his translation, but you kind of also had to know Latin, and that was actually he was actually the reason why the Catholic Church of the time uh, banned the translation of the Bible into languages without approval. And they actually dug up his bones and condemned him as a heretic for it, which is funny how all that works. But anyways, I'm going to start this off with Desiderius Erasmus and some of the folks that come right after him. Going through the Reformation era as far as the text is concerned, the English translations of the time, all the way up to the King James translation, and then revisions and further discoveries. So Desiderius Erasmus was an interesting man. He was a Roman Catholic priest. He was kind of interesting though because he was an individual who more so called for internal reform, but he did write in defense of transubstantiation. So I mean, some call him a middle of the road Catholic, but I mean he was still Catholic. I believe he had debates with Martin Luther among on certain other things, but he was an interesting individual. He was very knowledgeable in many areas. He was actually dubbed the Prince of the Humanists. Of course, what humanists meant then was basically it's not what it means today. What it means is somebody who wanted to learn the original languages, read things in their original languages, uh, basically Renaissance humanism, I believe was a term that it was called, and basically why read translations of these things when you can read them in their original languages. They stress that in certain humanities and whatnot, but this was the first person to actually print and publish a Greek New Testament. The first edition of what eventually became known as this, or the Textus Receptus. Now, it's not this exactly. None of the ones in the 1500s actually read this way. This, again, comes from the work of Scrivener when he took the King James Bible and went back and made almost like an interlinear to it. But anyways, his was the first edition to print and publish. Now, again, I say print and publish. There was actually a contender to him and his printer who had already printed a polyglot, the Complutensian polyglot, and they were waiting on papal approval because in that day you didn't publish anything without papal approval. And he beat them to the punch by dedicating the first edition to the Pope, and they took a chance, and it actually worked. And so he goes down in history as the first person to print and publish a Greek New Testament. This is, I can't remember which edition I pulled this from, but it's a picture. It may have been his third, but anyways, you could see that it's a diglot. Basically, that means you have two columns in two different languages. You could think of an English-Spanish Bible today. That's a common thing that you'll see in the U.S. But basically, you have Greek on the left side and Latin on the right. Now, he was more concerned, I believe so, with a fresh Latin translation, because again, they had the Latin Vulgate, and he took a lot of heat for giving a fresh Latin translation and also providing a Greek one, because who cares about the Greeks? You know, the Greeks are heretics. You have the Eastern Orthodox Church over there, and they were deemed heretics. So why we got the Vulgate? Why do we want one in Greek? Well, he was among various individuals who were pressing a desire, or expressing a desire to read the Bible in Greek. Ad fontes, I believe, was the call sign of the humanists of that day, and it means to the source. And they didn't want to have to read. Translations of things, and also Desiderius Erasmus also published Lorenzo Valla's notes, as I discussed in the previous session, and you know, that was not something that just anybody did. But if you haven't heard anything about that, go back to that last session. I discussed more about who Lorenzo Valla was. But anyhow, this was also an interesting one because there are some things Erasmus took directly from Latin. He used maybe a half a dozen to a dozen total Greek manuscripts, and for Revelation, he only had one. He borrowed Johannes Reuchlin's manuscript. And it was actually a commentary that he had to extract, and he didn't have the last leaf, so he actually translated from the Vulgate, the last 6 verses, and basically made about I think 17 different variants that are not found in any of the 400 manuscripts that we have of Revelation. And so he was, he couldn't wait. He was trying to beat Cardinal Jimenez to the punch of getting his work published. So Desiderius Erasmus has 5 editions. He passed away in 1536, but his 3rd edition was very interesting. I believe Martin Luther actually translated his 2nd edition into German, but the 3rd edition was widely used, but he took a lot of heat over the issue of what we now call 1 John 5:7. The verse divisions hadn't been made yet, but he didn't have a Greek manuscript that contained it, and he basically let out a challenge that said, hey, show me one, and I'll include it. He actually wrote to a friend in Rome to actually consult the Vatican manuscript, which would have been Vaticanus, if it had it, and he wrote back and said, no, it doesn't, it's not there. But it was in the Latin, but many believe that it was a writing of a manuscript that actually forced him to put it in, because it's real nice, ornate, paleographic evidence kind of shows that it was of his time, and he actually believed he was deceived. He wrote a lengthy note surrounding that, but anyways, that's something that I can talk about later. But again, Martin Luther, I believe, would have taken his 1519 text and translated it into German, and his 3rd edition was probably one of the most widely used. Now, as far as English is concerned, we know the story of William Tyndale. Tyndale was martyred for the fact that he took one of Erasmus's, I believe his 1522 edition, into English. And because at the time it was against the law. It was against the law to translate the Bible without approval. Now, of course, we have King Henry VIII, and we know how what became the Anglican Church and how he split away from the Catholic Church and all that good stuff. But it was under him that William Tyndale was executed for translating the Bible. Now, he couldn't finish the Old Testament. I think he only got a few books in. I think he got the Pentateuch in and maybe a couple others. But his work also eventually inspired other works that would be done eventually. You had the Matthew Bible in 1537, done by John Rogers. He basically translated it under a pseudonym, so they wouldn't find him and and tie him to a stake and use him to light the town that evening. So after Desiderius Erasmus, we have Robert Estienne. Now, he was a very influential individual as well. He's, I believe, a Roman Catholic turned Protestant. Eventually went to Geneva. And if you ever wondered where your chapter and verse divisions come from, because that's not the way the Bible was written. The letters of the Bible were written as just that. Letters or as history or as poetry or the gospel accounts. They were written as an account or a biography, if you will. Robert Estienne, also called Stephanus, he had a few texts, that he published, and his was very widely popular. But in his 1551 text, he actually came up and inserted the chapter and, I think they were already chapter division, but the verse divisions. So that's where every commentary and everything, they're going off of his. His is basically what stuck. And it was his 1551 edition that I believe the Geneva Bible ended up using. So one thing I want to note about these chapter and verse divisions is when it comes to actually reading the text and exegeting the text and being expository in your teaching and in your reading, so on and so forth, we read by chapter and verse, right? But you need to study by paragraph to paragraph. You really need to look into the text and see where do the paragraphs, where do the thoughts end and they transition, because there was not really a methodology to how the verse system was actually implemented. I'll give you an example. 1 John and the transition from chapter 1 into chapter 2. The chapter ends and begins in the middle of a thought. In the middle of a discourse, it stops. I'll give you an example. Romans 1, 2, and 3 would be after the introduction, the first 17, 18 verses. The first chapter in a modern paper or a modern book would be the end of chapter 1 all the way to the end of chapter 3 of Romans, if it was written by today's standards. But anyways, it's a really good tool. I'm not knocking it, but we need to understand that whenever we study, whenever we exegete the text, that we remember that those chapter and verse divisions were not there. Because how easy is it to pick a verse, even though it wasn't written as a quote-unquote verse, out of its context and just make it say whatever we want it to say. So in 1560, we have the Geneva Bible. This was Robert Estienne's text. Now, there was just I believe a small group. I can't remember how many there weren't very many, that actually did the Geneva Bible. And this was the Bible preferred by the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The Geneva Bible was widely popular, and it was a really good work. Again, they knew Latin better than they knew Greek, and they had some things going that they kind of missed, especially the Granville-Sharp rule and whatnot. There's the appearing of our great God and of our Savior Jesus Christ, because again, they knew Latin better than they knew Greek, and they missed that rule. But anyways, very widely used Bible. Now, the biggest issue, and this will come up later, has to do with their notes. Their notes are very theological. And that was something actually King James, James the First or James the Sixth of England didn't like, but we will get to that. So the next major individual to publish a Greek New Testament was Theodore Beza. Now, Theodore Beza was the successor of John Calvin at Geneva, and I believe one of his students was actually Arminius. And so you have that whole Calvinism, Arminian debate and all that going on. But anyways, his most influential text was his 1598 text. Now, this was an interesting text. It was the major edition of Beza, used primarily by the King James translators, and even this right here, in the preface of the Textus Receptus as done by Scrivener, basically says that they put emphasis, that they basically gave emphasis to Beza. And there's an interesting issue with his 1598 text that I'll get into later. And actually, I'll get into it right now. So, the issue with Revelation 16:5. Now, this is an interesting one because this is actually a variant, not within the manuscript tradition, but within the printed Greek text that we call now the Textus Receptus. You know, there's not just one; there's probably up to 30, depending on how you want to put it. But everything before Theodore Beza, the Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, and Revelation 16:5 read, is the Holy One, or O Holy One. Hagios is the term for Holy One, the Greek term for Holy One. Well, the King James translation, as well as all the revisions such as Webster's, Wesley's, so on, the New King James, and I even believe the MEV, which is the 2014 edition of the Textus Receptus in English, basically say "and shall be," which was Theodore Beza's emendation in from Hagios to Asamenos. Now, he gave a note as to why he believed that. Again, he didn't have too many resources when it came to Revelation, as we don't have. I mean, I think that's the least number of manuscripts that we have of any book of the New Testament, is the book of Revelation. And he conjectured, though he had a reasoning in his notes, that he conjectured, he admitted that he believed that Hagios was a parallel harmonization with another section of Revelation, and he thought Asamenos. It flows better, it's rhythmic and poetic and whatnot. But as of today, out of every manuscript that covers Revelation 16:5, there is no Greek manuscript that covers it. I mean, even the Latin doesn't have it. None of the other languages have it that way. And that whatever committee that did the Revelation text actually went with Beza on this one. Now, again, I just mentioned the issue of evidence. Oh, and considering evidence, what is called a majority text, by the way, this right here, this is a Hodges and Farstad majority text. Doesn't contain it either. It says Hagios. And same thing with actually 1 John 5:7. It doesn't contain it either, but that's something I get into later. So now we come up to the point of 1604. Now, this, I think, needs a little bit of a backstory before I actually just talk about, oh, hey, yeah, in 1611 we have the King James Bible. Now, James I of Scotland, he assumes the crown of England after Elizabeth I, and one of the things he did was he held a council with the bishops and the Puritan factions, because he inherited a factious country. And one of the things that he had made a big deal about was unity. You can actually read, I believe it was his 21st birthday, he basically commanded the Scottish nobles to walk hand in hand through Edinburgh. And of course, his father was a well-known figure in Scotland who was actually assassinated when he was a child. And so he made a big deal about unity, so he holds this council, and it's a very famous council. If you have any chance to go on, get an encyclopedia or get online and look it up and actually read about everything that went on. So where does the King James Bible actually come from, or the AV? Well, in the midst of this council, King James was hearing the arguments and the complaints of the Puritans, and he was really just shooting them down. He basically said, no, 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 I don't care, no. But he also had this deal about change being slow over time and allowing for just that kind of stuff. He didn't want radical, dramatic change just all at once. But eventually, a great Puritan scholar by the name of John Reynolds pitched to him that, hey, why don't we have a new, fresh translation of the Bible in English? And because the bishops had the Bishop's Bible, which I think King James would have gone with, but he apparently didn't look too highly upon the Bishop's Bible. And you had the Geneva Bible, which was a good Bible, but he didn't like the theological notes about it because it was monarchical or whatever. And of course, James has this thing about unity, and of course, he's the king. But anyways, he takes his this pitch of a new Bible to thought, and he says, okay, yeah, okay. And you know, the cool thing is, y'all are going to work together on this one. So in the decree or the commissioning of it or whatever, there wasn't really an official sanction of the king, but he did say that the bishops and the Puritans were both going to work on it. And so you have basically them will end up splitting into their different committees and working on this process. Now, unfortunately, John Reynolds, he ended up dying during the translation of it, and I think it was him. I can't remember how many others actually died, but there was a few. So, real quick, before I go on, this is basically a list of your English Bibles all the way up until 1611. You have the John Wycliffe Bible, as I mentioned, in 1380, the Tyndale New Testament, and of course the few books of the Old Testament he was able to do. Coverdale, Matthew's, the Great Bible, which was commissioned under Henry VIII, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I believe what they did was they used the Bishop's Bible as a base text, and where it was sufficient, they basically would have kept the reading. But and that's actually how most Bible translations are done today. They'll use an earlier translation as a base text, and where its reading is sufficient, they'll keep it. But where they think, oh, either A, this is wrong, or B, it could be better said this way, then that's kind of how many of them are done. I think one of the only ones is the Christian Standard Bible, the HCSB. I think that was one of the only modern ones that's actually considered a fresh translation. Of course, and now in 1582, I didn't really talk about this one, but the Douay Rheims, that was the Catholic Bible. The Catholics realized, oh crud, we got the Bible in English, we better do our own. Not really talking much about them though. And then of course in 1611, in that 7-year period, you have the completion of the 1611 authorized version, or now known today as the King James translation. So I want to talk about the King James translation because this was really the first Bible translation that was done by a massive committee of very astute scholars. They had their limitations, and I mean, if you ever read their notes that they did in all their meetings, they did it in Latin. And again, they knew Latin better than they knew Greek, so that they had some issues there because they relied a lot upon Latin, and Latin doesn't have articles, and there are different rules and stuff like that. But immediately after the translation of the King James, now it's a great translation, and I'm not really worried about misprints and printing errors, as you see in the others. They also did the Apocrypha and spelling fine, stuff like that. Not really worried about. But the revisions that came after, there were the King James Bible that you would buy on the shelf today. It's essentially the same as what was there in 1611, but there are differences. The two main revisions that you will find today are the Oxford and the Paris revision. I think there were actually two Paris revisions done, one in 1760 and of course 1762. I think there may have been another, but it obviously probably wasn't very widely used or popular. But you had the Blainey revision at Oxford in 1769. Now, most King James Bibles in print today read as one of these or mixed. And this is my Ryrie Study Bible by Moody Publishers in King James, and it actually reads mostly Oxford. It takes in the variations. It'll actually take the Oxford ones. There were other revisions not entitled King James. You had the John Wesley New Testament. You had Noah Webster. Not many people know. Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary. He actually had a revision that did not bear the name King James Bible, but he did revise it. And I did put Young's literal translation. Now his was a translation, but he was either an idiot or he was really smart, because you try to read his translation, it's very hard to read. But anyways, that was one done by one person, and I mean, as much as I might reference a translation done by one person, you can't really rely upon that, because you've got biases and leanings and stuff that aren't going to be evened out by a committee. Some say that there may have been a Unitarian on a translation committee of the King James translation, but the committee that he was a part of would have balanced out any odd leanings that he would have had. Now, when I talk about the revisions and the differences, these three areas. Now, there are more, and the other ones are really not that big. It depends on how they spelled Lord. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, or capital L, lowercase O R D. And of course, that implies, well, is this the term for I am or Yahweh being translated or not? If you ever see that in your translation, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, that means that they're translating what comes out in Hebrew as what we would see as YHWH. It used to be called Jehovah. Most scholars use the term Yahweh because there's no J in Hebrew. But anyways, these three areas, when it comes to the differences between Oxford and Cambridge, Jeremiah 34:16 says, "Whom he had set at liberty," or "against whom ye had set at liberty." Well, he is singular and ye is plural. Which one's correct? Joshua 19:2, Beersheba or Sheba, or Beersheba and Sheba. Obviously, or and are different. And Ruth 3:15 is he went into the city, she went into the city. Obviously, those are different. Now, the main reason for these revisions and why they did them, you had a lot of misprints, you had a lot of oddities coming out at the time, because again, printing was it was better than handwriting, but it was still manually done, and there were still a lot of mistakes. And this basically standardized the text for basically that modern. When that era was modern, even for today, they're still in wide use. But anyways, that's something to think about. So real quick, where do we get this term Textus Receptus? What does it mean? Obviously, if you know Latin, you know it's Latin. So in 1633, there was a family of printers known as the Elsevier brothers, and they produced something that was similar to this. Now, they were one of the first ones to do it. Basically, they created a Greek text that was based upon an English translation. Now, granted, this is Scrivener's text, and this is the what some call the standard text. A standard Textus Receptus. But anyways, the term Textus Receptus comes from 1633. So it's interesting. We say the King James is a translation of the Textus Receptus, or the Geneva is a translation of the Textus Receptus, but they're not. Well, they are, but they weren't called that. It's a reference to the printed text of the 16th century. And of course, and the ones that were done afterwards. But it actually comes from an advertisement, because that's how they advertised in Europe in those days. Their advertisements were in Latin, and so therefore you have the text now received by all, in which we give nothing altered or corrupt, or we say Textus Receptus. That is where we get this term. And so it wasn't a term that was just used throughout history of Greek. It was actually an advertisement. So very interesting. All right, so of course at this time I would take questions from folks, but obviously I'm not doing live, and if I ever do this again, I'll do it for them. But anyways, that is a basic history of where the Bible came, in English at least, and how what we call lower textual criticism actually began. Desiderius Erasmus. Now, a lot of people don't like that term, textual criticism. They think you're just standing over the text and criticizing it. No, that's not what it means. Desiderius Erasmus, Robert Estienne, and Theodore Beza all engaged in what we would call textual criticism, which means they had manuscripts in front of them, and they were looking at them, they saw the variants, and they made choices between readings and how they believe which one would have been original. Each Bible translator would have done the same thing if they were using more than one text. The King James translators, they didn't use manuscripts. They used the printed Greek editions, and then of course they referenced other English Bibles, they referenced other languages, the Latin and so on and so forth. But they had printed Greek text in front of them, and they had to make decisions. They used textual criticism. Now, it wasn't necessarily a consistent form of it. To give you an example, Matthew and Romans, the command uphaniusis, which is you shall not murder, thou shalt not murder, one way it's translated kill, one way it's translated murder. So they're not wrong, it's just they weren't consistent in saying, hey, these all committees, when you see this phrase, you're going to translate it this way. And that's just for continuity and consistency. Excuse me, but anyways, that is really where all of that began. What we would call today is lower. I'm not talking about higher criticism. Now that is where people are looking at this, the Jesus Seminar, Dan Brown, all these weirdos, or even some scholarly individuals like Dr. Bart Ehrman, very knowledgeable individuals, where they say, well, we just can't know what the Bible ever had to say or what the New Testament says. Now they engage what's called higher criticism. But that's what lower textual criticism is. It is basically taking manuscripts, comparing them, looking at the variants, and you're basically making a choice of which one do you believe to be original. All right, I've got one more session after this. Thank you for watching. Hit like, subscribe, give me any questions in the comments, and I will try to get back with you as soon as I can. I actually just finished my final class for my degree, so I can devote a little bit more time to stuff like this. And thank you for watching and listening. God bless.